If everyone can take their seats, please. Welcome back to the 2022 Illinois Main Street Conference. We are so happy that you are here at the City of Bloomington, McLean County Museum of History. Thank you again. You've probably heard this a couple times, but thank you again for taking the time to learn about how to grow and sustain downtown districts and ensuring that they are the centers of economic and social opportunity. I'm Kimberly Smith. I'm the Assistant Director for Economic and Community Development with the City of Bloomington. And I'm going to introduce our two speakers and then get out of their way. First up, if I haven't already said this, we are being live streamed. So if you do, when it's your turn to talk, we will bring a microphone to you if you have a question at the end, but also just to be aware, this is in fact being live streamed. So Jose Lopez has written extensively on political and social reality of Puerto Ricans in the United States while serving as executive director of the Puerto Rican Cultural Center Juan Antonio Correter in Chicago, which he co-founded in 1973 and is an adjunct at the University of Illinois at Chicago. In his role as educator, activist, he has been invited to speak at over 50 colleges and universities in the United States, Mexico, Canada, Puerto Rico, as well as international forums such as the United Nations Decolonization Committee. For over 50 years, he has been a leading member of the Puerto Rican independence movement. Presently, he is active in developing in community and social empowerment, particularly in the areas of educational reform through the community as a campus initiative, and addressing health inequities through the building of holistic community of wellness in Chicago's greater Humboldt Park communities. We also have Senator Cristina Pacione Zayas, PhD, serves on the Illinois Early Learning Council Executive Committee, Illinois State Team of the BUILD Initiative, and Title V Needs Assessment Advisory Committee for the state's federally mandated maternal and child health services. Her service in Chicago public schools and in Lace, Chicago, built a track record for leveraging community partnerships, implementing restorative justice practices, and supporting the leadership of young people, parents, and educators. Senator Pacione Zayas has served on the Educational Success Committee of Governor J.B. Pritzker's transition team and the Education Committee of Mayor Lori Lightfoot's transition team.
That's your part. Awesome. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming back. We're going to kind of kick this off. You know, those who were in the morning plenary, we gave a really high-level overview, setting a little bit of the context, talking just real high level about the bill, and then going into sort of leading into what Dr. Lopez is going to cover at the end of this presentation before we get into the Q&A. I want to just kind of do a little bit of like backtracking. You know, Jose had mentioned that there was a housing summit with the author of the book Root Shock, and really the importance of the work that's happening in the community. But I think it's also really important to talk about, like, this isn't just a concept that came up, you know, in 2019 or whenever we had, I can't remember when, it seems like the years are blurring, but this isn't a concept that just came up in the past few years, right? This is built on a body of work for decades. And I want to just give, you know, the mic really quickly to Jose to talk about the 1993 work that kind of set the foundation for this so that you can kind of understand the trajectory of the story.
Thank you, Christina. And let me just say that we talked a little bit about the summit 5 years ago. I want to just focus in a little bit about who convened it. This is the Puerto Rican agenda. The Puerto Rican agenda is an organization made up of literally the movers and shakers of the Puerto Rican community in Chicago. The first Saturday of every month, we meet and we discuss and we work on envisioning, looking at our situation, but more importantly, addressing possibilities. And so we began this process long time ago. But I want to highlight that in 1993, in actually May of 1993, our newly named alderman of the 26th Ward, which is the ward in Chicago with the largest concentration of Puerto Ricans, he was named to replace the then alderman who became Congressman Luis Gutierrez. By the way, I take full credit at least for having been their teacher. So I'm kind of very proud of that. But the idea, this convening of a summit that brought together over 1,000 people in 1993 was to really look at what was happening in the community and what could we do. And one of the problems, obviously, was already the encroaching problem of gentrification, particularly in Wicker Park, in West Town, in Bucktown, in Logan Square. As a matter of fact, Cristina was born and grew up in Logan Square. Her father was deeply involved in work at Roberto Clemente High School in Humboldt Park, West Town. So this is the area that we consider the greater Humboldt Park community. And so we came up with some ideas. Literally, everything we have accomplished since 1993 is visible in our community. From the creation of those flags, which speak to the presence and persistence of the Puerto Ricans in Chicago. Those flags are made out of steel. They measure 59 feet up, 56 feet across. They're made out of steel because the first migration, one of the first migrations of Puerto Ricans that arrived in Chicago in the 1940s went to work in the steel mills. They're made out of pipelines because another group of Puerto Ricans came to work in the steel pipeline industry of Chicago, and their pipelines welded together because another group of Puerto Ricans came to work in the welding industry. So we contributed as a community to the growth and development of Chicago as an industrial bastion. And so we needed to say that. But also, this flag was erected on the 100th anniversary of the adoption of the Puerto Rican flags in New York City by Puerto Rican exiles living in New York City in 1895 and were members of the Cuban Revolutionary Party, which Jose Marti, the great Puerto Rican poet and leader, created in New York to struggle for the independence of Cuba and Puerto Rico from Spain. And so the flag is literally a carbon copy of the Cuban flag. And so we did that, and that's one of our first projects. And we could go through until, by the way, those flags were just made landmarks that were given landmark status in the city of Chicago. But we can go through a whole plethora of initiatives. I think all of you have the little brochure, and you look at buildings like this. All of this came out of the planning that took place in that first summit. And most importantly, you'll see a beautiful building that is a historic landmark, national historic landmark, that is inside of the park, which became our National Museum of Puerto Rican Arts and Culture. So when you look at this and you look at what we've come, so we added like another dimension to this development by proposing the creation of a cultural enterprise district which stretches 2 miles long.
So obviously, you can probably discern that everything has been thought through. There is meaning imbued in every single structure along what is known as Paseo Boricua, which is, you know, the strip that is encased by the flags, but has now, even before we introduced this piece of legislation, the alderman of the ward had an ordinance to recognize what would become Puerto Rico Town. So extending that strip further west, did he widen it out? I can't remember. Did he widen it out, or is it just the strip all the way to Costner, right?
No, it is to Pulaski. Because
Pulaski.
part of the problem in there was that if we moved, we wanted to do it to Costner, but the problem with Costner is that you involve then 2 other aldermen, and that becomes a little bit more muddy.
Right. So, I mean, so I think what's important to kind of note is, you know, those discussions in the very beginning about chronic challenges, but then possibilities, right? How do we solve for our own problems? How do we become the drivers of those particular solutions? Because, you know, as many acknowledge, those closest to the problems always have the best solutions. And then how do we take it further where formal government is recognizing that this space is, you know, is claimed by a community and is also shaped by a community, and that this acknowledgement at the ordinance level and now what will be at the state level is that it will live beyond all of us. It is something that can really speak to legacy building work, and how do we, and that's where the moment of like when we actually had to draft the legislation, right? You have a concept, you want to be authentic in that concept, you want to be true to the intent, but you always have to think about it from all 4 corners. What could potentially be the unintended consequences, right? How do we make sure that we are aligned with what we hope to do? And how do we ensure, because one thing I've learned as a legislator, sometimes it's not what you put in the legislation, it's what's left out that can be prohibitory in terms of what you need to do. So you really have to like use that part of your brain to get outside of your bubble and your comfort zone so that you are not later down the line like, oh man, we should have said that, right? And then we also learn where the limitations are, right? Because we could have, or what we were initially wanting to do is be real prescriptive and specific, but we had to think broader, right? Because when you're thinking about state legislation, you have to think about how can this piece of legislation benefit all of Illinois? It's not just one community, it can be a tool in any community. And I think that was also a really important kind of, you know, in the back of our minds, thinking about how do other communities see themselves in this particular work and wanting to advance the visions and the possibilities that they are developing within their unique context. So, as I had mentioned before, in the Puerto Rican agenda on those Saturday mornings after, you know, we had that housing summit that was also commemorating the 50th anniversary of a very important housing institution in our community that has been a leader in developing affordable housing in our community. How do we go from, you know, convening everybody, naming the problem, articulating it very well, because oftentimes we stay in the problem, and then actually generating something that can begin to mitigate the problem, solve for it, and move beyond the problem. And so from that point, we started to look at other models in the country. And we had found, you know, there had been spaces in California and Florida that had did some interesting things with like special taxing districts where they could levy a tax that would go towards specifically funding a project of this sort. That got a little too complicated, and when we started to look a little bit further into it and into what we call LRB, the Legislator Reference Bureau, we were able to see that if we embed this into the code of the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, there would be a way, a space for it to live. You know, I teach policy classes, and I think a lot of times with our students, we always ask, where does the policy live, right? That helps you figure out where you can locate, where you can influence that particular policy. So the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity is a wonderful space because in so many ways, not only does it marshal resources, it also provides technical assistance to entities to spur economic development and commerce. And it can go from, you know, the very big, you know, the Rebuild Illinois capital investment that, you know, invests in all of our, what we call our vertical and our horizontal infrastructure here in the state, to the very colloquial, like the Main Street investments, right? It does the whole range. And so when we started to put together our kind of original idea, how do we build on what is already in place? How do we also build on the city ordinance and now bring it to the level where the state recognizes it? And that's where this whole concept of the state designated cultural districts came from. And in the actual articulation of the bill, we had to say, okay, what is a state designated cultural district? What is the criteria to qualify or to be eligible for this particular designation? And that's when, again, thinking you want to have sort of in mind a particular community, but you also want it to be broad enough that many communities can see themselves in it. And so it literally in the text says, state designated cultural district means a geographical area certified under this section that has a distinct historic and cultural identity. And then we started to name who can apply for that, right? So municipalities can apply for a designation, and 501c3 organizations, nonprofit organizations, right? You can have a geography as, you know, small as Puerto Rico Town, you know, the strip that we're talking about, or you can have some contiguous counties that recognize themselves as having a relationship of, and also being able to say they're distinct, they're historic, and there's a unique cultural identity. I had been working with a group in Pembroke, and there is 200 years of history there with Black farmers in the Pembroke Township. That area in and of itself as a township can be designated as a state designated cultural district. And so the other piece with respect to like, okay, now we know, okay, basic definition is this, we then wanted to kind of set some parameters for what that work would look like. And so that area would be seeking to promote itself as a distinct historic and cultural community. It would be looking to encourage economic development and support entrepreneurship in that specific area. It would also encourage the preservation and development of historic and culturally relevant structures, traditions, and languages. You see, we broadened it out there. It's not just the physical, it is also the symbolic. And then the fourth area, it would foster local cultural development and education, trying to be comprehensive, and then provide a focal point for celebrating and strengthening the unique cultural identity of that community. And then the last piece, which is incredibly important, because this was the whole, ooh, we can't have these unintended consequences, right? Promote growth and opportunity without generating displacement or expanding inequality. Because sometimes what happens in gentrification, especially if you've been living in a community that has historically been struggling with access to resources and adequate housing, and therefore some of the conditions that come with that, such as community violence, oftentimes you have indigenous residents that are like, hey, I'm happy that the neighborhood is quote unquote cleaning up. This is great, this is progress. When in actuality, you have a timeline on how much time you can be there because you're about to be priced out. That's what we wanted to be intentional about, is making sure that this, in the name of progress, in the name of development, it's not at the cost of the original residents that that community helped to shape. So, and that bidirectional relationship, you're shaped by your community, you also shape your community. And so, you know, as I mentioned, DCEO, Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, is stated in here as the administrating body in which they would articulate the application and, you know, further refine the criteria, but we made sure that we wanted to have significant community input. So we also inserted language in here of an advisory committee. So making sure that there is public input, and anytime there is an advisory committee that's appointed by the governor and member leadership in both of our chambers, it's subject to Open Meetings Act. So we had designees listed on here who would be coming from the various departments that we see helping to kind of round out the support, technical assistance, and opportunities for these state designated cultural districts. So not only a representative from DCEO, a representative from the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Tourism, the Illinois Housing Development Authority, and then there would be 4 members from the General Assembly, 2 from each chamber, 1 from each party, and then 4 community representatives that would also kind of round out the diversity on that advisory committee. So making sure that, again, we're being intentional so that we're not stacking it up a particular way, but this can truly be an exercise of Illinoisans recognizing an opportunity to co-design a community development tool that has never been constructed before, and that is really calling into question, what does development look like when it honors people's humanity, when it honors their contributions, and that it is specifically designed to keep them in their homes, in their communities, continuing to have evolution and progress, but not at the expense of the original folks that are there. So another kind of important point is that this is a time-sensitive piece of legislation. It actually has a sunset in 2031. And so, and it calls for no more than 15 state-designated cultural districts. And the agency cannot grant more than 5 at a time. So it would kind of, you know, help to kind of like pace out the number of communities that would be seeking these designations. So then you're probably like, okay, wait, so you have the designation, now what, right? This is part 2, and this is what I have to work on in the next session, is making sure that we have funds for this. Because the vision, right now, all this is that there's a process to get a designation. And there is guidance that these cultural districts will receive technical assistance to be able to take advantage of funding opportunities from DCEO. I'm in discussions with some of our folks in DCEO about there being priority points awarded to these state designated cultural districts when there are funding opportunities, so that can help leverage or fast track resources to them. I also even brought up, because I've been in those positions of writing these crazy grants, and you know, you just got through filling out all this paperwork to get designated as a state designated cultural district. Do you have to repeat in the application all that same? Can we crosswalk it? If you have this, you can skip to part D and not have to worry about filling out A, B, C. So thinking along those particular lines, the designation also can serve as a leveraging opportunity, because oftentimes when entities are applying for grants, you have to find a match. And so again, we want this to have value so that we can figure it out. But I think what was really just, you know, delightful to be a part of is that when we introduced this bill in both chambers, people were excited. People saw themselves in it. everyone from, you know, the southern tip of Illinois. I guess there's a Polish enclave in southern Illinois that I was not aware of, that one of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle brought to my attention. And she was the one that actually gave us the feedback around making sure that those 4 community designees represent identities and lived experiences that may not be represented with the other advisory committee members. And we actually expanded, because I think initially we were going to have 2 community members, so we wanted to have a little bit more and round that out. But we even had, you know, we had bipartisan support. Both of these, we actually had 2 bills, companion bills, and people were incredibly enthusiastic, and they passed unanimously. It was the Senate version that we were able to eventually get over and get signed to by Governor Pritzker. But I just think this is really a testament that, you know, we were trying to solve for a very specific problem in one community. But, you know, as Jose has mentioned before, we're seeing these problems across the globe. And this is why a solution like this is wildly popular, because people are trying to solve for some of those basic human necessities. But as Jose likes to problematize, they are very much ingrained and connected to cultural expressions and identity. And so it's really important to use culture or cultural identity as the fuel for economic development, not as something separate and apart, nice, ornate, oh wow, look at the ceiling, fabulous, how nice. No, it actually has a power to it. And I think that, you know, there's more to come, but I'm really pleased, because the last time we talked, he didn't know this information. We're having our first advisory committee meeting on Tuesday. I did have to push and prod a little bit, because, you know, the bill was signed back in, gosh, when did we sign it? It was, I think well, we did a bill celebration, October 15th, 2021. We felt it was really important to mark the moment. The bill had been signed, you know, back in, I think, June or July of 2021, and we had like a little press release, but I was like, no. Governor, I need you to come to the community, and we need to really, you know, mark this moment, because this is a brand new tool. And he actually had some input on this, because very early on, we brought the concept to him. He was the one that said, you need to at least give this 10 years. You cannot just, because initially we were thinking like, you know, 2 to 3 years, we can do that. He's like, no, you've got to be able to have a long enough runway to be able to demonstrate that your proof of concept. And that's going to then help you to really be able to ensure its permanency, but also get more folks brought into the process. So we had a huge celebration October 15th, 2021. The actual law went into effect January of this year. And anyone who works with me on the state government side knows I like to make fast friends. I like to put folks on speed dial. I like to just figure out, okay, how can we, you know, cut through this red tape? And it was a couple months ago, I was like, hey, we're coming up on the year anniversary. We need to get this application out at least before the year anniversary, because we've got a timeline, 2031. You know, this piece of legislation will sunset unless we extend it. I'm not guaranteed to be here forever, neither are you, so let's go ahead and get this in motion. So I'm really pleased that we're able to, you know, start that process. Like I said, it's an open meeting. You all are all welcome to join in, listen, participate. It truly is going to be a co-construction process, and I'm really thrilled. That's one of my pillars of work in government, is how do we make our processes more transparent and inclusive and accessible, and I think this is going to be a really good opportunity to demonstrate that.
So I just want to follow up a little bit, and it may be not the time to do it, but I wanted to say, following with the comments that the senator made about the governor, one of the interesting things with this governor was that before he launched his candidacy for governor, we had already started to talk about this idea of creating cultural enterprise district. And he had convened a meeting of 15 Latino leaders in Chicago. And we had a deep dive into what would inform some of his policies. And we obviously raised the idea of this cultural enterprise district. And almost a year after he got elected, we were in his office already coming up with the plan, and that's where he added these dimensions. I just want to say that for me, this is the kind of people in government that you need, that at least learn to listen. And I think this is important because that's what really makes politics real. So that said, I wanted to just point out a few things. One, this issue of gentrification. I'm going to say something that's going to be probably quite controversial, but I'm used to that. And that is that we're living in a period that came into existence about 500 years ago. And it was with the colonization of the Americas. At that very moment, as a historian, I've studied that period. I have studied all of the places and things that Columbus did. I have a very, very good background on Columbus. And one of the things about Columbus, there's no doubt that he was a smart man, but what was driving him was that he was a merchant, a wool merchant, okay? And he wanted to get a route to the east via the west because the Ottoman Empire had established the Mediterranean as a Muslim lake. So out of that need, he sets out ultimately on this expedition. But it's an expedition driven by the profit motive. When he establishes the settlement in the Americas, the first settlement, which was Navidad in the Dominican Republic, immediately thereafter, the Queen of Spain, of Castile, Isabella, issued a royal decree creating a system, the first forced labor system in the Americas, the encomienda. And the encomienda comes from the Spanish word encomendar, which means to entrust. And she said, I am entrusting the conquistadores to save the soul of these non-believers. So, you can take away their land, you can take away their resources, you can take away their labor, and you justify it by having them baptized into the Catholic Church. Your first expression of racism is right there. You have created a class of people who are now the other. And that's how modern racism really begins. And we've got to understand that modern racism is the justification for the colonial enterprise. That's what we usher in 500 years ago, the colonial enterprise. And all over the world, this is the real problem of the world today, is colonialism. Okay? That's really what structural racism is. So, that said, one of the driving motives, one of the driving characteristics of modern colonialism has been the process of spatial deconcentration. I want you to understand gentrification as a highly sophisticated process of spatial deconcentration. The enslavement of African people was a process of spatial deconcentration. The fact that we can sit here in native people's land, that westward expansion that in many ways has been used as what defines the American spirit, that westward expansion was premised on spatial deconcentration of native people. All over the world, people, wherever you have a colonial enterprise, you have people that are spatially deconcentrated. You cannot understand modern migrations and the refugee questions unless you understand modern colonialism. Okay, that's just a sidebar to gentrification. I could spend a whole lot of time talking about this, but I'm just raising this as a way for you to think about the modern city and what we've done with the so-called excludables. Because we can take away their land, we can take away their labor, we can take away their resources, and then we can justify it. And by the way, racism has gone through 3 distinct processes and market that we can literally, historically, and chronologically see. One was the theological basis. The second was the scientific basis, the eugenics theory that was best expressed by one of the great writers of the English language, Rudyard Kipling, who says, "It is the white man's burden to bring civilization to the lesser breeds of mankind." That's the theory of eugenics. White people have bigger brains. They had a right to conquer the world and to subdue the world. This is what drove Hitler, eugenics. But by the end of the Second World War, it was difficult to justify eugenics. So now we got another explanation, and that's cultural. And my friends, we're living the cultural war. And racism is the way I see much of the cultural war is on the question of race and racism. So those are the 3 evolutionary processes of modern racism. So that said, we got to think about gentrification. Gentrification, as the senator premised, is often posited as a way to do what? To improve city life, to bring progress, to bring prosperity, to bring all these wonderful things. Well, I'm going to show you something. On that strip that we created, the 2 flags, Paseo Boricua, in between those 2 flags, there are 50 businesses. 50 businesses. A few years ago, there was a election for alderman, and one of the candidates posited the idea, what we need in the 26th ward is to actually do what they're doing on the other side of Western, on Division, on the other side of Western. If you go on Western Avenue and Division, you will see 2 different worlds. The world of gentrification in terms of economic development, and the world that we're trying to maintain in that community. It's like this. Well, since putting up those flags, we have maintained those 50 businesses. Not a single one of them was closed during COVID. and not a single one received government help. Okay? So, and we can talk a little bit about that later on. I don't know if we have time, but I just want to be able to at least try to explain some of these things, because I think we got to take deep dives on these things. And part of that is to understand. So I asked this young man who was running, he had been my student. He came and said hello to me, and how was I? I said, not very well, because you decided to run. You never sought my advice. You never sought the advice of the people that live here. I said, do you know how many businesses are located in this area between the two flags? I have no idea. I said, I thought so. But he was a master's degree in business, in business administration. How can you be running for an area and don't even know how many businesses are here? I said, there's 50 businesses. All of them owned by people that live in this community. Whatever wealth is generated stays here. Okay? If I ask you how many businesses are on the other side, oh my God, you got all these businesses owned by Starbucks, by Yoke, by all the multinational corporations. Where does the money go? Outside. I said, how many people are employed by these 50 businesses? I don't know. Again, stupid answer. I said, 350 people are employed. They all live in this community. The people on the other side, you find a brown person or a black person working in those businesses. They're working in the kitchen or as the cleaning staff. They're not even the baristas or the mixologist. There's something wrong with that picture of development and progress. Progress and development for whom is what we should be asking ourselves in terms of how we envision. And I want to just throw out a word that I want you to think about. Thinking about having a radical curiosity, that we have to think of a different world. And that means we're curious. And it has to be radical. Radical comes from the Latin word root, to look at roots and root causes. So, for me, the idea of this cultural enterprise district is to enhance the economic development of this area that's organically driven from the bottoms up, that approaches the idea of social progress from the perspective of a holistic approach. And what does that mean? It means that in your brochure, you see 4 pillars. I think it's there also. 4 pillars that drive, and I outlined this earlier, but these 4 pillars are education, economic development, affordable housing, health, and wellness. Even though health, arts, and culture, I mentioned, that is not a pillar. So it's explained sort of in this little picture that you see here. That picture is a rendition of a home of the indigenous people of Puerto Rico called the Bohío. And that is a word that comes from the Arawak language of the Taíno people. And the Bohío was what one of the greatest writers, I believe, of the African American experience, a woman by the name of Bell Hooks. She wrote a wonderful book called Yearning, Race, Gender, and Cultural Politics. And she writes about home place. She says, I want us to honor them, obviously the women, not because they suffer, but because they continue to struggle in the midst of suffering. if I went into the black community, I went into most of the poor communities and the colonized communities and the marginalized, what I would find is a whole bunch of women that are suffering, but are also struggling. Continue to struggle in the midst of suffering because they continue to resist. I want to speak about the importance of home place in the midst of oppression and domination, of home place as a site of resistance and liberation struggle. What a wonderful quote. So, in this home place of the Taíno, we explained the 4 pillars. So you got the pillars that hold up the roof. And if you look at the roof, this is what the roof does. It covers everything. That's what arts and culture and creativity really mean. We must look at culture from the vantage point of a wonderful concept I learned many, many years ago in a religion class at Loyola University. It was taught by a Chinese priest. And he said, how do you explain that in the midst of poverty, in Cambodia, in all of Asia, you will see these beautiful golden gilded pagodas in the midst of poverty? And he said, it is because the people deposit and put all their wealth into this building, this golden gilded pagoda, because this building is a symbol of collective aesthetics. Think about that word, collective aesthetics. Think about home place and think about your own home. And most people's best place at home is their living room, right? Because that's what people see. That's why you invite your guests, not in your bedroom. Well, some people do, but no. You invite them to your living room, right? Your living room is the expression of your collective aesthetics. You have everything that you want to show off. And that's the site that we have to look at community as the place, as home place. Bell Hooks further says that home place, the domestic space, was the site where black people in the midst of oppression recover their wholeness. And black people taught us one of the most amazing pedagogical lessons. By the way, they are the only people that use this. Only black people. They coined the phrase teachable moment. Think about what that means historically. You were a slave. You had no time to speak to your children, to share anything. The only time was when you came together at night. That was home place. In that hut. And this is where you learn and pass on the historical memory that's so powerful that I would say the African diaspora created one of the greatest examples of resilience, in that there is no music in the Americas, and particularly in the Caribbean and Latin America, that's not driven by what we call claves, the rhythms of Africa. That's what makes us who we are. And so, a people who were stripped, spatially deconcentrated, used those little tiny spaces of home place to pass on historical and cultural memory. that's exactly what we're talking about, creating a cultural enterprise district, where everything is melded, where there are no, you don't divide it among your education, your economic development, your housing, all of your basic needs, because your basic needs are also expressed through collective aesthetics. And so, what I want you to think about these pillars is how they're intersected. So, one of the great problems of the world today is obviously global warming and climate change. Well, how will this resolve the problem of global warming and climate change? 17% of everything that's, I mean, if I took the carbon footprint and I was to divide it into pieces, 17% of the carbon footprint is caused by the transporting of food across the world. 17%. We could eliminate it. You know how? Creating an urban agriculture enterprise that in this area of 2 miles long on Division Street between Western and Pulaski, there are hundreds of buildings, all of them with flat roofs. What could you build in those flat roofs? Greenhouses. What can you do in greenhouses? Produce 365 days a year. I would submit to you that we could produce all the food, you could create a food justice system, an equitable food distribution, and an economic enterprise along that strip based on your urban agriculture production, and you would have no carbon footprint. We could do that everywhere, people. One of the things that we didn't bring here in this slide was a slide of a greenhouse that we built. We have an alternative high school, and we built a greenhouse. Okay? You should see what we grow there year-round. Almost all the products that you use to make one of the best parts of Puerto Rican cooking, which is the sofrito. It's a paste made of about 15 different herbs and spices. Makes Puerto Rican food the best in the world. So, we can do that in a very small space. We could envision the possibility of producing enough food and enough, obviously, the wellness of people as well, because we have a food system that's culturally relevant, that is able to produce tropical goods, and you can use very little space, people, to produce a lot. In other words, we could think of an informatics urban agriculture program driven by the highest levels of thinking in terms of using algorithms to do that. I'm going to stop here because I think I've talked too long, and I know we need some time.
Yes, we got Q&A we want to honor, but I just think one, you've obviously covered the pillars and the context for the theory of change. If you can just speak a little bit to the phases, with Puerto Rico Town. And just for any clarification at this point, Puerto Rico Town concept, pieces of it are moving. You all have the maps here and the brochure that tells you and kind of illustrates for you. They will likely be applying for a state designated, cultural district. recognition, but if there's the 3 phases that were kind of expressed with respect to how you plan to carry it out.
Well, I mean, for us, the idea is that we obviously, at every juncture, it is to be able to have our community input. But it is also centered on the idea that these 4 pillars are articulating a vision. We just had a summit on health. In this process, you will see an amazing, beautiful building, the Humble Health Wellness Center, the Humble Health Hospital, a wellness center. So you're going to see an articulation, the same thing with our educational process of creating a community as a campus practice. So in other words, every step is being articulated in such a way that we're moving. While the state has not recognized us, we recognize ourselves. So we're not waiting for the state to recognize us. We're going to do it whether the state recognizes us or not. Because people in resistance don't need to be officialized either. But officialization actually brings resources, an important thing. But I would say that's what we're...
And all of these steps are about stabilizing
Yes.
the corridor and repopulating the blocks, because, you know, as was referenced in terms of gentrification as a fueler of deconcentration and displacement, this is really about a revival.
Yes.
How do we bring our people back and have a space where they see themselves in it, where they can participate in the transformation of the physical space, the home placemaking, and in and of itself transform themselves. I mean, that's where you go from the individual to the collective to the macro and then back.
So I just want to point out that in here you will see some of those initiatives. I should add that we're looking at creating, our alderman has made a commitment to creating within the next 4 years 1,500 affordable units in that area. Okay, affordable units. And that would include the Hispanic housing building, which will be an 84, 85 unit building on the corner of Division and California. It will include, hopefully, a building that we're working out the sort of things with the city on top of the Erie Family Health, the skywrites to build a 7-story building with about 100 or 150 affordable units. We're already working on, actually, next month you can come on Paseo Boricua and see one of the most beautiful buildings anywhere, the Paseo Boricua Arts Building that we talked about earlier. We're building another, Hispanic Housing is building another building just a block north of Division in California, which will be 45 affordable housing units. In other words, we are really trying to bring back people who were expelled out of there. That beautiful building of Teresa Roldan is 59 units of affordable housing for the elderly, and I'm one of those. In our community, I don't live there, unfortunately, it's a beautiful building, but that is for all the people who have been displaced from that area. They can spend their last days in a beautiful space with balconies. You gotta go there and see it. So we are taking all the steps necessary to make sure that we are able to carry this out even before the state designates us.
So, want to leave this time questions? We've got 7 minutes.
I'm curious about the tactics you use to transfer ownership of properties from landlords and those not in the neighborhood to those within the community. I mean, I have a neighborhood like this in our town, and I'm just imagining what it's going to take to get people to relinquish ownership of the properties. What tactics do you use to do that?
I didn't understand.
So you're, I guess what, if I'm understanding, I don't think that the proposal is to remove people. I think it's more to repopulate. There's a lot of vacancy. There's also not enough affordable housing, right? There might be available units, but not at the affordability rate that, you know, the indigenous population within that area can afford. There is also one bill just to put out that I'm going to be introducing is a task force on community land trusts. This is another tool that can be used to help stabilize a community and to really push back against the price gouging with like market rate real estate transactions. It would, basically the concept is that there's a community-based organization that purchases the land and holds it for 100 years or whatever, how many long, but the actual structure is sold at below market value to encourage the staying or the re-entry of a household that may had been displaced. We had our first pilot of that actually in the western portion of Humboldt Park. And the first homeowners that grew up in that area, been pushed out, but were able to return because the community holds the land, but they were able to purchase the structure. So that's a different kind of tool, but at least the proposal for this is not to push existing landlords out. I think it's more about how do we increase the supply of affordable units and incentivize landlords, particularly those that have multiple units, to be able to subsidize the costs so we can bring it down and not at market value.
Thank you. I find this fascinating, and it's the first I've heard of this program, so this has been really interesting. I'm curious, historic preservation has often dealt with the problem of not just gentrification, which seems like you're addressing that well, but sort of museumification of a place, stagnation of a place, that the whole purpose of preserving was to maintain the vitality. How do you, once you're designated, once you've put some of these programs in place, how do you maintain the vitality that attracted or that created that place in the first place when we can't freeze time, right? We can't freeze people. So how do you do that?
Well, I think one of the, in the bill, we talk about, you know, what additional criteria would make a geography attractive or competitive to be able to get this designation. And I don't know if you all are familiar with like quality of life plans. So the, what does LISC stand for? Yes. So Local Initiative Support Corporation had been operating in Chicago for decades now to really work with local neighborhoods to develop what is called a quality of life plan, sort of like a 10-year vision addressing the chronic issues as well as core areas for development and investment, but again, being very sensitive and attuned to the priorities, the lived experience, and the vision that the community would like to see over the next 10 years. Usually a lead agency is designated to kind of facilitate the process and bring in other organizations to carry forward that vision over time. I happen to work in one community that went through 2 iterations of it. When I first came on, it was like the first 10-year mark, well, the first plan for 10 years, and then shortly after I left, there was another iteration of that plan. I bring that plan up because that's what we kind of had in mind in terms of ideally communities would have that comprehensive vision of, you know, this isn't just development for, you know, ornate reasons. You know, we've got these beautiful colonial structures. It really is thinking through how do we really connect the need for housing with some of our core areas of education, of small business enterprises, and how do we do this in a way that is authentic and organic within the community so that it can revitalize or enhance the trajectory it's already on. Dr. Lopez mentioned there's this Mercado, which is a business incubator, and that right there, the fact that last year there were 5 business licenses issued for, what started as concepts and ideas for folks, but then actually turned into a viable business that can now begin to populate the district or the main strip, our main street, right, Paseo Boricua. So I think it's some of what we were trying to account for is that communities would have these comprehensive strategies, so it's not siloed, it's not piecemealed, but it's really about a larger vision of repopulation, revitalization, or enhancement, and ultimately setting the stage for the next iteration of the community, but with the community at the center and not with displacement.
And just on our building, the arts building, is you will have 24 apartments that were made literally for artists to live, produce their artwork. The hallways would become literally galleries where they could sell their artwork. So it would be 24 small businesses created right there. And by the way, it will have a 99-seat theater that is going to house one of our best theater company, urban theater company in Chicago.
So I think we're at time, right? And we want to honor, was there anything?
Within the United Way. They've also done a lot of those types of community studies as well as sometimes community foundations. So just in case across the state there's other resources that do similar work, just wanted to give that resource out.
And I really, I think there's contact information on these brochures. I definitely would love to see you all come and visit. There, in the newspaper here, documented just one of our most recent celebrations celebrating the 29th anniversary of Fiesta Boricua, which is the big festival between the two flags, that obviously honors our Puerto Rican identity, but also makes a linkage back to the island in different towns that we invite delegations and continue to form those connections and relationships and have that kind of like umbilical cord back to our homeland. But I really encourage you to continue to stay in touch, to look out for the application for the state designated cultural districts. I will be pushing to get that out by the time we have the anniversary of the effective date. And happy to answer any further questions.